Alright, that should do it. Won't be any Latverian air support bothering us on our way to Castle Doom now. We'll take it on foot and bring in Bravo team once we hit checkpoint 3.
On foot. You're kidding, right? Do you have any idea how little arch support I get in this outfit?
Put a sock in it, webhead.
Ow, socks make it worse, actually.
Alright, ladies, let's move, now!
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So those of you who have been following my channel will know that a few weeks back, I made a long, in-depth review for the original Marvel Ultimate Alliance from 2006, which, as those of you who saw the review will know, is a personal favourite of mine. It's one of the few games that I actually bought several different releases of over the years, and it's one that I've 100%ed on several occasions. Towards the end of that review, I briefly mentioned that I was considering making a review for the sequel. However, at that point in time, I no longer owned the sequel, and needed to rebuy it. I went out and bought a copy of the game shortly after uploading that video, since quite a few people in the comment section made it clear that they wanted to know my opinion on it. So here it is finally. We're going to be looking at Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2, released in 2009, developed by Vicarious Visions. Before I go any further, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, since it really helps the channel, and also feel free to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. Also, before I get started with the review, I feel like I owe you guys an explanation for why it took me so long to finish it. So those of you who saw my latest community post will know, I initially intended to have this review finished over 2 weeks ago. However, I ran into a bit of a technical disaster in the process of making it. Basically, I played through most of the game, getting to the second part of the negative zone level, right after the part where Iron Man and Cap decide to put aside their differences, which is right near the end. And by that point I had recorded about 15 gigabytes of footage for the review. Not only did I complete the levels, but I specifically demonstrated several aspects of the game, and I unlocked all the characters, all the costumes, and found most of the collectibles. I also recorded pretty much all the relevant aspects of the story, as well as the overall gameplay mechanics and level design. All I had to do was finish the last couple of levels and prepare the review. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is my hard drive that I was using to store all the data for the channel randomly broke for seemingly no reason, and I lost everything. All the footage, all the files, everything that I had ready for the review, as well as a whole bunch of other files for other projects I was working on. So needless to say, I was absolutely furious. I even considered scrapping the review altogether. Fortunately though, I promised you guys I would review the game, and I like to keep my promises to the best of my ability. I went out and bought a new hard drive, found a slightly more efficient way to record and store footage, and continued where I left off with the review. I finished the game from where I previously got up to, got the relevant footage, and decided to restart the game on New Game Plus. Yeah, thankfully this game has a New Game Plus mode just like the first game, where you can restart the game and play through it with all your level ups, collectibles and unlocks. It meant I didn't have to go back and grind all over again. So yeah, long story short, I finally got all the footage I needed for an in-depth review. Speaking of, just like with the first game, this is going to be a long ass video, because I have a lot to say about this game. And unlike the first game, which my opinions of were pretty much 100% positive, and I basically had no criticisms for it whatsoever, this is a game that I actually have a lot of mixed feelings on, and it's always been a game that I'm in two minds about, even since when it first came out. So before I go any further, a bit about my own personal history with the game. With me being a massive fan of the first game, I was hyped to no end when this game was announced. I can specifically remember saving up my own money to buy it as a kid, and getting it as soon as I could afford it. I thought surely there was no way they could possibly mess it up. I loved both X-Men Legends games, and Marvel Ultimate Alliance took that very same concept, as well as the exact same user interface. I figured with this game being a 7th generation title, and continuing the series, it was going to be the best one yet. Unfortunately, when I played this game, I was massively disappointed with it, and if truth be told, it just didn't meet my expectations. What's weird about this is that despite being so disappointed with the game, I couldn't actually figure out why that was at the time. For whatever reason, I just didn't seem to take to it the same way I did the first. I mean, objectively speaking, the game is very good. It pretty much follows the same formula as the previous games, and doesn't do anything drastically different. But for me, there was just something about it that soured the experience. If I remember rightly, I played through the game twice as a kid, and the only reason for the second playthrough was because I wanted to see what would happen if I joined the opposite side in the Civil War portion of the game. More on that later. After playing through it twice, I put the game away and never played it again until all these years later for the purpose of this review. So I didn't play the game for about 14 years, which should be a clear indication of how little an impression the game made on me compared to the first. After playing through it again for the purpose of this review, I'd say I gained more of an appreciation for what the game has to offer, but at the same time I think I've finally figured out what it was about the game that made it so that it never really appealed to me back in the day. Let's talk about it. So just like the first game, it's once again a third-person action-adventure RPG with an isometric view. It's worth pointing out that this is the first game in the series not to be developed by Raven Software, which I actually didn't know at the time it came out. Instead, as I mentioned earlier, this game was developed by Vicarious Visions, a developer that was always a bit hit and miss in my opinion. To be fair, they did have some experience developing Marvel games prior to this. For example, they developed Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro for the PS1, as well as the PS2 version of Spider-Man 3, both of which I reviewed on the channel a while back, link in description. So it's not like they weren't capable of making a game like this or anything like that. I just find it a bit odd that with all the success Raven Software had with the previous games in the series, that Activision would replace them with another developer like that. But I digress. The game of course features drop-in drop-out co-op and can support up to 4 players. The story of the game is a pretty bizarre one, and very different to the first in terms of its overall tone and writing. The game begins in Latveria, which is of course the home country of Doctor Doom, the main villain of the first game, who at this point in time is believed to be dead. You get a pretty epic cutscene where a team of superheroes led by Nick Fury launch an assault on Latveria.
That hurt. But it worked. No pain, no gain, my boy. I ain't your boy, Stark.
You find out pretty much right away that Fury has hard evidence that the new Prime Minister of Latveria, Lucia von Bardas, is in league with several supervillains and is planning to invade the United States.
One of our ongoing investigations into supervillains recently had a major break. We've always been aware that many of these criminals who run around in high-tech armor were getting their materials from an underground figure, Phineas Mason, aka the Tinkerer. But what we didn't realize until recently is that the Tinkerer himself is being supported by someone outside the country, specifically Lucia von Bardas, elected Prime Minister of Latveria.
This prompted Fury to assemble the team of superheroes to strike first and stop the invasion before it even takes place. Here you get a useful tutorial where you learn pretty much everything you need to know about the overall gameplay. As I mentioned before, it follows the exact same formula as the first game. You take control of a team of 4 superheroes. You can switch between these heroes at any time during gameplay using the directional buttons, and you fight your way through a series of linear levels, defeating enemies and completing objectives. You start the game off with a default team of 4, basically the characters who were introduced in the cutscene. These characters are Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man and Wolverine. So it's the same default team as the first game, except they replaced Thor with Iron Man. You fight your way through the streets of Latveria, wiping out waves and waves of soldiers, as well as robots, en route to von Bardas' stronghold. What you'll notice right off the bat is that the game's combat, while very similar to the first, feels a little bit slower and less hectic. Though to its credit, this is a 7th generation game, and it does have a pretty major graphical upgrade from the first, so the combat moves and how they complement the game's character models, as well as the animations, do look better than the first and a lot more realistic. Just like the first, you can strike enemies with both light and heavy attacks. Heavy attacks do more damage and have a knockback effect on most enemies, and quick attacks obviously allow you to strike enemies in combinations. You can also mix and match these in combinations to do more damage. You can also once again grab a hold of regular enemies and perform a beatdown on them. Obviously this won't work on larger, more durable enemies. Tank characters with super strength will be able to pick up enemies and either throw them or use them as a melee weapon, which is quite funny. There are plenty of throwable objects in the environment that can be used as projectiles, allowing you to throw them at enemies. Just like the first game, each character will once again have their own superpowers that can be activated by holding down the right trigger, and pressing whatever button each power is allocated to. Unfortunately, they removed the ability to customize this, and you can no longer allocate different powers to buttons yourself, which is a bit of a bummer. You once again have 4 separate powers for each character, each with their own uses. This is probably a good enough time to talk about the game's roster. Let me be as blunt as I possibly can here. I was massively disappointed with the roster this time. That's not to say that it's a bad roster, but when compared with the first game, it's honestly quite pathetic. And I'm not just talking about the number of playable characters, I'm talking about how many playable characters they decided to remove and the ones they replaced them with. So the playable characters you have in this game from the beginning are the 4 I previously mentioned, in addition to Gambit, Iceman, Storm, Mr. Fantastic, The Thing, the Invisible Woman, the Human Torch, Songbird, Luke Cage, Daredevil, and Iron Fist. In addition to these characters, there are also several unlockable characters who you can add to the roster as the game goes on. These characters are Miss Marvel, Jean Grey, Thor, the Incredible Hulk, Penance, Deadpool, who once again brings his own unique brand of meta humor.
And you, dumb as nails shield clones! I saw what you did to those cherry blossoms back there! You think those things grow on trees?
More on that later. Green Goblin, Venom, and Nick Fury. Not just regular Nick Fury like the first game. In this game you get a cyborg version. I'll talk a little bit more about how you go about unlocking these characters a bit later in the review. Suffice it to say, they're all very easy to unlock, if you have any video game sensibilities at all. I know in other versions of the game, such as the handhelds, there are a few more playable characters, but I've personally only ever played the Xbox 360 version of the game, so I have no experience with those. I know when the game originally came out you could purchase Juggernaut as a DLC character, but unfortunately that DLC was removed due to licensing issues, though I imagine he was probably just a reskin version of the Hulk or the Thing. So yeah, you have a similar number of playable characters to the first game, at least the base version of it, but sadly they removed some of the more interesting ones. Characters like Silver Surfer, Ghost Rider, Doctor Strange, Moon Knight and several others are nowhere to be seen here. Other playable characters from the first game such as Colossus, Black Panther and Spider-Woman make several appearances here but are not playable anymore. This actually pissed me off when I first played the game, since some of these characters were really fun to play as in the first game. I still to this day can't get my head around why the developers decided to remove characters from the roster. Surely it would have been entirely possible and made much more sense to keep the whole entire roster and simply expand upon it rather than replacing the characters with new ones. I mean, why would I choose to play as Songbird or Penance rather than Silver Surfer or any of the more legendary Marvel characters from the first game? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever to remove these characters. Also, why didn't they add the Punisher? That would have been badass.
You're kidding, right? Guy's a psychopath and he wants to join us? Cry me a river. The guy is straight up certifiable, Cap. Did you even for a second consider bringing that nut job on board? That guy ain't no team player. We're better off without him, man.
I don't know about you guys, but I would trade Luke Cage for the Punisher any day, but that's just me. So yeah, long story short, I was very disappointed in the game's roster this time, and for me it's one of the things that soured the experience. What makes it even worse is that some of the more interesting characters you can play as, such as Hulk, Venom or Green Goblin, don't get unlocked until right near the end of the game on a first playthrough. And unless you really enjoyed the game's story, and that is a big if, you're probably not going to have much of an incentive to play through the game again. Thankfully, just like the first game, each character feels very different and unique in their own way, and they have their own inherent attributes that give your team an advantage during gameplay. For example, certain characters can fly, and this can help you to reach certain areas and collectibles that are otherwise unreachable or unobtainable. Some characters have super strength and can pick up large objects in the environment, such as cars, and use them as projectile weapons. They can also be used in certain puzzle sections to move certain objects and obstructions. I would advise having at least one tank character on the team. In the early part of the game, I decided to have the Thing on my team, for the most part, since he seemed to be the strongest and most durable. That is until I unlocked the Hulk, of course. Certain characters such as Wolverine and Deadpool have extremely powerful and fluid melee attacks, being able to do slashing damage to enemies. Other characters such as Iron Man, Gambit or Nick Fury have powerful ranged attacks, as well as energy attacks that can serve several functions. I would advise having one of these types of characters on the team at all times, making sure your team has a varied and diverse set of abilities for all situations, and powers that go well together. Once I unlocked Thor, I pretty much always had him on my team, since just like in the first game, he just seemed to be the most powerful and most well-rounded character. Not only can he fly, but he also has super strength as well as very powerful melee attacks, and even ranged lightning attacks. So having him on the team is a major advantage. Iceman once again has elemental powers, yet these don't seem as powerful this time. He can also once again surf on ice, which can help you to get around levels much quicker. Once again, Spider-Man and Venom can once again swing on webs as an alternative to flying. Deadpool once again has the ability to teleport, which can help you to flank enemies, and to escape when you're overwhelmed. Though sadly they seem to have made the ability a lot less useful this time. They seem to have removed the ability to teleport through walls and skip certain areas. Basically they nerfed the teleport ability. Another major change to the combat as well as the superpowers is the removal of the classic extreme powers. These were of course a major part of the previous games in the series, with each character having their own special attack that would need to be charged up with a momentum boost. These were badass and very different for each character. What they replaced these with in this game was actually an aspect of the game that the developers seemed to be very excited by during the game's marketing. These were the combination abilities.
Wait! We can join our powers! It'll be some sort of, what's the word? Unification or combination, something like that. You get the idea.
Basically, as you defeat enemies, your momentum meter will increase. Once it fills up, you will have the ability to perform one of these combinations. These will force two characters to combine their powers for a short time, allowing you to perform insanely powerful attacks, some of which can take out multiple enemies at once.
We're outnumbered. Work together. Smash them all at once. There's the intel. Grab it.
There are a few different types of these. You have clearing attacks, which are designed to wipe out all regular enemies within a certain radius. Guided attacks, which allow one character to give some sort of boost to another, allowing them to basically charge at enemies and run right through them. And targeted attacks, which basically allow you to perform a one-time attack, targeting one particular enemy. These are of course very useful against bosses or larger, more durable enemies. Initially I was very impressed by these combinations, and I thought that they were truly a worthy replacement for the extreme attacks. Unfortunately, it didn't take me long to figure out that most of these are practically the same. They're basically reskinned versions of each other, and once you've seen one type of combination, you've basically seen them all. Which is a bit disappointing since the extreme attacks never got old, and were genuinely different for every single character. In retrospect, I don't get why they didn't just keep the extreme attacks, and add these combinations as an extra feature, or at least make them all different. It's not a major issue or anything like that, but it's something I thought I'd bring up anyway. So yeah, the combinations are what they are, and they're a good addition to the game, but like I said, they shouldn't have been a replacement for the extreme powers. So aside from a few small changes, the combat is largely the same, except with much better graphics and animations. The game of course has a leveling up system. Those of you who saw my review for the first game will know that I mentioned that the leveling up system had been slightly dumbed down and simplified from X-Men Legends 2. This is something that actually got the game a bit of criticism back in the day. Well, if that bothered you about the first game, then it's definitely going to bother you here, because this game is even more simplified. Once again, you defeat enemies and complete objectives, and this levels up your characters automatically, and as you level up you will gain skill points. These can be used to upgrade each individual power one at a time. Each of the 4 powers will become available as you reach a certain level, and you can choose to invest skill points into whichever one you have unlocked. In addition to that, you can also upgrade each character's attributes, such as the effectiveness of their melee attacks, their durability, and their energy regain speed. You upgrade these by collecting coins, or should I say orbs this time, just like in the first game. You collect these orbs by defeating enemies and breaking boxes or containers in the environment. It's wise to try to collect as many of these as possible as you play through the levels. You also get red orbs the same way that refill your health bar, so be sure to collect these as well. As I mentioned before, it's been even more simplified from the last game, and there are no customization options whatsoever. You simply accumulate points, level up automatically, pause the game and dump points into whatever power or attribute you choose. Very simple. Personally, I don't mind this, but I can imagine many X-Men Legends fans and players of more hardcore RPGs might have a problem with this. There are also a few other ways to gain XP and level up your characters. For example, you once again have the simulation missions, which serve the same function as the Danger Room in X-Men Legends, and the comic missions in the first game. Unfortunately, they didn't add each character's unique comic mission this time, so the simulations were nowhere near as interesting, but it is what it is. You can also gain XP by playing the trivia game. Here you can test your knowledge of Marvel Comics lore. If you're a big Marvel fan, you'll probably enjoy these. As far as the overall level design goes, this is something that for me was a bit of a disappointment. I mentioned how the overall gameplay formula is pretty much the same as the first game. That's true in regards to how the game works and how it plays, but the problem is that the level design here just doesn't do its bit to add to the experience. It's just kinda boring. The first game had a whole bunch of crazy and exotic locations, with each level having a distinct art style as well as a unique atmosphere. It was incredibly creative and it felt like it came straight from a wacky comic book series. Unfortunately in this game, levels are bland by comparison, in my opinion. It's as if the developers wanted a more grounded, realistic experience for the player, but that doesn't work in a game based on Marvel Comics, which is a wacky, fantastical universe that isn't supposed to represent real life. It's supposed to be escapism. The first game had you travel to Asgard, the land of Thor and the Vikings. You travelled to space and got caught up in an intergalactic civil war, a creepy, sadistic carnival where everything in it tried to kill you, filled with minigames and retro throwbacks. You travelled to China to deal with Mandarin and all his sci-fi-esque minions. You even visited another planet at one point to take on Galactus, the World Eater. There were so many insane locations in that game, and it made it so unique and memorable, which is of course very important in a game. In this game, the levels are just boring and lame as far as I'm concerned. You go to Latveria, as I mentioned before, which is dark, gloomy and barren, where everything looks the same. You go to an abandoned military base in Jersey, where again everything is dark and looks the exact same. You go to a prison for a little bit and then end up in the negative zone, which initially seemed quite interesting, until it descended into a bunch of copy and paste hallways that again all look exactly the same. Seriously, that level made me want to rage quit, since I felt like I was going in circles even when I wasn't. You go to Washington DC for about 5 minutes, which looks bright and vibrant and was a decent change from the previous levels. Unfortunately, that level felt very short and restrictive. In fact, most of the levels felt restrictive to me. There were invisible walls everywhere. The first game was very linear too. and I don't mind that one bit since it helps to prevent unnecessary backtracking. But at least in that game there were plenty of secret areas, a few twists and turns here and there, and many destructible environments, and the unique art style of the levels as well as the overall atmosphere made up for the lack of choice in regards to traversing them. In this game everything just felt like a hallway, with areas all over the place that looked like I should have been able to explore them, but the game wouldn't let me due to invisible walls. You have to take into consideration that this game came out in 2009 and is a 7th generation game, so the developers had the technical ability to make levels more complex and more interesting, and instead it seems like they went backwards in that regard, making the first game seem superior technically. I did enjoy the Wakanda level at the end since that one seemed a little bit less restrictive than the others, and again it was bright and vibrant, and had a bit of a sci-fi style towards the end of it, so it was at least interesting to traverse and it was interesting to look at. It's not just the level design that had this issue, the game also has a serious lack of enemy variety, at least when compared to the first game. In the first game, every single level had a bunch of different enemy types, all of which felt very different from one another. The X-Men Legends games had even more enemy variety if I remember rightly. This game on the other hand really doesn't. Most of the enemies just feel like reskinned versions of each other, and it seems like the longer the game goes on, the less enemy variety you get. You fight soldiers, robots, bigger robots who are more durable and can take more damage. The soldiers return all the way through the entire game with a slightly different character model. Occasionally they will have rocket launchers or some sort of large weapon, but these are few and far between. For example, you fight S.H.I.E.L.D. agents for a large majority of the game, and these are just reskinned versions of the Latverian soldiers from the game's intro. Later in the game you fight nanite controlled enemies, and again most of these look and feel the exact same, and even the more powerful and larger ones are just larger, more durable versions of the same enemy. It's almost hard to describe, but the enemy variety in this game just sucks, which is a real shame because that's something that all the previous games in the series had going for them, lots of enemy variety throughout. On a side note, you do fight the odd helicopter from time to time, so that's something I guess. So the lack of interesting levels and the lack of enemy variety are things that just hold this game back for being as great as the first game. Thankfully though, the game does have plenty of excellent boss battles. Some of these are actually better this time, particularly the main bosses. So just like the first game, each level will have a bunch of regular bosses, and usually by the end of the level you get a main boss. These are usually much more difficult as you could imagine. For the regular bosses, you usually come across them guarding something, or carrying out some sort of task for the main boss of that particular level. Most of these are basically obscure Marvel villains, some of which made an appearance in the first game, but most of them are new. Some of them you take on just one at a time, others you take on multiple at once. For example, you take on the likes of Electro, Shocker, the Grim Reaper, Wizard and Scorcher, A-Bomb, Bullseye, Equinox, Diamondback and many others. At a certain stage of the game you will be forced to choose a side in the Civil War, which takes up a large portion of the game.
The paperwork is right here. Step up and sign, please. Because it's the law, and because if you don't, we'll drop you so fast your super little heads will spin.
More on that later because I have a lot to say there, but I digress. Here you will face several heroes as regular bosses, depending on what side you choose. For example, you take on the likes of Colossus, Black Widow, She-Hulk, Wonder Man and several others. Again, these will depend on the side that you chose in the Civil War. This also applies to some of the main bosses. As far as main bosses go, you take on the likes of the Tinkerer in his battle mech, Lucia von Barden in her cyborg form. That boss was actually quite tough on our first playthrough. You take on Deadpool in kind of a reference to X-Men Legends 2.
Fine! Time for a little boss battle, suckers!
He becomes playable shortly after. Same with Penance after you defeat him. You take on Titanium Man, Whirlwind. You also get an epic battle against Nick Fury. These bosses are pretty awesome for the most part and I really enjoyed them. Unfortunately, as fun as the boss battles are, getting through the rest of the levels to reach them is usually a bit of a chore. Just like in the first game, in between levels you get to explore a hub world of sorts. These are basically chill out sections that allow you to do some role playing. There will be several characters in these hub worlds to talk to, and they usually have something to say about the events of the game.
We must assume so. It is a great loss for our side. Now, if you'll excuse me, there is much to do.
You get to hear a bit about these characters' views and opinions and how they feel about the current situation. Some of these conversations are quite funny too, and some of them are even a bit awkward.
Thanks. Same to you. Sorry, I have to get back to my work.
One interesting change made to the conversations this time is that the written dialogue choices you will get will sometimes be worded a bit differently depending on which character you're playing as. For example, if you're playing as Thor, you get his classic speech patterns. Same with Gambit, who will say things in his New Orleans accent. Again, these are just dialogue text boxes, and they don't really change the conversations at all. The responses and the questions are usually the exact same, but I appreciate the effort nonetheless. You also once again get some unique conversations depending on who you're playing as from time to time. If that character has some sort of relationship with the NPC, then chances are they might have a short unique conversation with each other. In addition to this, you also have 3 separate responses to NPC comments. You get an aggressive response, a defensive response, and a diplomatic response. This was a good idea in theory, but unfortunately it doesn't really make much of a difference to the conversation.
You're right. I've had something of a checkered past. I've made some mistakes, but I want to do the right thing. I'm just grateful the Cap took me in. Alright, I don't need you to remind me.
Also, once you've asked about 3 or 4 questions, the NPC will just tell you to bugger off automatically, and the conversation will seemingly end prematurely, which is disappointing in my opinion. However, despite the different responses making virtually no difference to the game's story, you can unlock a special boost medal for choosing a certain amount of dialogue responses in the same category a number of times. So that's something at least. Gives you a slight incentive to try different responses and adds a little bit of replay value.
I guess folks assume I stand for the American government. I don't. I stand for the American dream. The American way of life. In the end, I'd say freedom. I think the Founding Fathers would agree. We have to stand up for what's right, no matter what.
Sadly though, I found the RPG elements of this game to be severely lacking for the most part. There are usually only about 3 or 4 characters to talk to in hub worlds, and there are no side missions or investigations or anything like that. You don't get anything like the Weasel side mission from the first game, which is a bit of a shame in my opinion. What's interesting is you also have some unique conversations in the main levels, even with some of the bosses.
Matt, I can't believe you're siding with Captain America on this, going against the law. Being asked to sign a piece of paper isn't oppression. You people are overreacting. Regardless, I can't let you go any further. I don't want to fight you, but you're giving me no choice.
Even Stan Lee makes an appearance at one point.
Maybe we should put this registration business on hold.
Hey, that would be great.
We'll see what we can do. I'd hate to disappoint a former member of the Yancey Street gang. Well, best of luck trying to catch that maniac. Like our state motto says, Excelsior.
Don't I know you from somewhere?
You don't look like the voting type.
So yeah, the game has plenty of dialogue, but for me it was nowhere near as funny or as interesting as the first game. This brings me to my main criticism of the game, and the thing that for me made it much less replayable than the first, and that is the story. Let me be as blunt as I possibly can here. The story of this game sucks. It's such a disappointment in my opinion. And the sad thing about it is, it had a lot of potential. The next part of the review will contain some spoilers, though if truth be told, I wouldn't worry about it since the game's story is uneventful. There isn't much to spoil. So as I mentioned before, the game begins with a team of heroes led by Nick Fury launching an assault on Latveria. It's revealed very early on in the game that the strike was unsanctioned by the American government, and that Fury acted on his own accord, organising the mission without informing the relevant US authorities. and also without informing the heroes of the relevant details. This leads to a retaliation 1 year later from the Latvians as they attempt to invade the US. Due to the retaliation being directly caused by the heroes' actions, the US government, as well as many of the general public, start calling for some kind of reform. They come up with an idea to force all metahumans to register with the government and essentially become deputized. This is amplified by the fact that a superhero reality TV show ends with a disaster, when a villain called Nitro blows up an entire neighborhood, wiping out hundreds of innocent people, while being chased by a group of rookie heroes. This leads to Iron Man, with the aid of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the US government, setting up his own task force to round up all metahumans who resist government control. Meanwhile, Captain America, who believes in the US Constitution, small government, and good old-fashioned conservative freedom and liberty, forming his own resistance movement named White Star.
All it's going to take is one more slip-up by anyone in a cape, and we'll be lucky if registration is the worst they do. They could just turn us all into criminals, hunt us all down.
No, they won't, Tony.
This leads to a superhuman civil war, which is of course based on the widely popular Civil War storyline from the comics. As I mentioned earlier, you will be forced to choose a side. Join Iron Man and register with S.H.I.E.L.D. and the government, or join Captain America and fight back against government tyranny. This sounds like the setup for a great storyline, and one that would provide a tremendous amount of moral ambiguity and a tremendous amount of replay value. Unfortunately, the way this concept was executed in the game was so bad that I almost can't believe how badly they messed it up. It's such a wasted opportunity. First of all, let's talk about it from a gameplay perspective, which is of course the most important thing about a game. Whatever side you choose makes virtually no difference to the gameplay. The levels you take part in are exactly the same. You join Iron Man, you fight S.H.I.E.L.D. agents with White Star outfits. You join Cap, you fight regular S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. You join Iron Man, you attack a base in Jersey. You join Cap, you defend that base. Except you basically do the same thing, fighting through it against the same enemies. I mentioned before you have different boss battles depending on the choice, but unfortunately this is a bit of an illusion, since the bosses are basically reskinned versions of each other. For example, you join Iron Man, you fight Cable. You join Cap, you fight Bishop. And these bosses are the exact same, just reskinned. Likewise, you join Iron Man, you fight Ant-Man. You join Cap, you fight Yellow Jacket. Again, the exact same boss, reskinned. Regardless of what side you choose, the levels, combat, and overall gameplay do not change one bit. The only thing that actually does change is the fact that certain characters from the roster will suddenly become unplayable for this portion of the story. You join Iron Man, you obviously lose access to Cap, and you also lose access to Luke Cage and Iron Fist. You join Cap, you lose Iron Man, Songbird, and Mr. Fantastic, which makes sense of course. Certain characters would have a set side depending on their ideology, and it does its bit to add a consequence for choosing a particular side.
You have no idea what you've just done.
Par for the course, crazy lady. Besides, I can always go the other way on my next playthrough.
Unfortunately, this feels very broken conceptually. From a story perspective, there are several things about it that break the immersion. For example, Mr. Fantastic joining Iron Man. That of course puts his family in an awkward position. The game addresses this by having the Thing leave the team and go underground regardless of what team you choose, since he doesn't want to become a puppet of the government, but at the same time, he doesn't want to fight his best friend Reed.
Hey Reed, this is Ben. Look, I can't do this. Lord knows I've followed you into some pretty crazy places over the years, but somehow this is one place I can't go. I've been thinking about it for a long time. Registration's wrong, and I won't support a law I don't believe in, but I'm still a patriot. I ain't gonna fight my own government, so the way I see it, that leaves me only one choice. I'm out.
This makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, despite this, the Invisible Woman, who is Reed's wife, continues with whatever team you choose. The game even has unique dialogue between some of the Fantastic Four addressing this.
I'm not sure that's been determined, Incarceration, most likely. Those who violently resist might accidentally be harmed. Of course it isn't Sue, but anyone who openly resists law enforcement should know the risk they're taking. Now please, I'm surprised to see you're even considering joining those rebels. Stay with us. I need you.
I'm sorry guys, but I don't buy for 1 second that Reed's own wife would turn on him and join the opposite faction, fighting against him while he's doing what he believes to be ideologically right. I just don't buy it, and like I said, it completely breaks the immersion for me. Likewise, you can join Iron Man's side and still have people like Wolverine on the team. There is no way on this earth that Wolverine would ever agree to a Superhuman Registration Act. Again, I just don't buy it. Also, I like how Iron Man randomly just becomes a total psycho for some reason.
Thanks for being such good sports and playing along. You must have realized that you're all far more valuable targets than anyone in that convoy. Enough to put you on the top 100 richest list. But my armor is hardly your biggest concern right now. Speaking of which... Now don't play too rough with your new toys, Hank.
Aw, you never let me have any fun.
Although, to be fair, Cap isn't much better here.
I think you'd better get to Cable, Captain. He needs your help defending that old Hydra base we repurposed. Of course, Cap. Didn't mean to step out of line.
So yeah, long story short, you join a side, the levels are the same, the boss battles are the same except reskinned, and the story starts to make no sense, and starts to break the immersion. And speaking of story, again, whatever side you choose in the Civil War, it makes no difference to the story whatsoever. The cutscenes are the exact same, the ending is the exact same, and everything that happens beyond the halfway point of the negative zone level is literally the exact same. Meaning, what is the point in replaying the game to join the other side? There's no point if it makes no difference aside from gaining achievements or picking up a few slightly different collectibles. Or if you really want to hear the few different lines of dialogue from each faction, trust me, these are nothing to write home about. The game's ending is also incredibly anticlimactic, and what pissed me off about it too, is it seems to have been done deliberately. What I mean by that is that certain conversations in the game hint at there being a big-named Marvel villain lurking in the shadows, manipulating things. The game teases this reveal several times during the Civil War portion of the game, and sets you up for some sort of crazy twist. Unfortunately, this never happens, and the way the game concludes was just so lame. So basically, the game has this weird subplot where Mr. Fantastic and Iron Man come up with a way to manipulate the minds of captured supervillains. So characters like Venom, Green Goblin, Bullseye, Lady Deathstrike and several others are helping out the government against their will. Something goes wrong with this, and an unknown outside entity somehow takes control of the villains and starts corrupting the entire metahuman population, creating a hive mind of sorts, kind of like Dagoth tried to do in Morrowind. And again, the game deliberately makes you wonder who's behind it all, pulling the strings. It's mentioned that Doctor Doom might have secretly returned and is plotting his revenge, that Baron Zemo might be involved, and that even Mr. Sinister could be behind the whole thing. This is of course very exciting since the end of X-Men Legends 2 made it very clear that Mr. Sinister was going to return with a plan of his own. Unfortunately, none of this happens, and spoiler alert, it's the Tinkerer, the guy whose arse you kick at the end of the first level, and the guy who we've seen multiple times up until this point. You gotta be kidding me. The game is also incredibly short, and has nowhere near as many side objectives or secrets as the first game, so despite having a New Game Plus mode, I don't really see you wanting to replay this right away after finishing it. Thankfully, to its credit, the game does have plenty of bonus features. As I mentioned before, you can unlock new characters as the game goes on, each with their own requirement to unlock. Certain characters will be unlocked automatically at a predetermined point in the story, such as Miss Marvel, who will join your team after you rescue her from Shocker. Some characters you will have to first defeat in a boss battle, such as Deadpool, Penance, and both Venom and Green Goblin, who you fight at the same time. Once you defeat these characters, they'll join your team. Just like with the first game, you can unlock Nick Fury by completing the main story. The rest of the characters will require you to find a certain amount of collectibles to unlock. For example, to unlock the Hulk, you will have to find 5 gamma regulators, and once you find them all, he joins your team. Likewise, Jean Grey and Thor can be unlocked the same way by finding their own relevant collectibles. Thankfully, these are very easy to find due to the overall linear nature of the game, so it's very easy to unlock all the characters. Also, there are actually more of these items than you need, making it even easier to unlock them. In addition to these collectibles, there are also boosts that can be picked up after defeating bosses. You can also unlock these by completing several challenges or requirements in the game. These boosts can be added by pausing the game and selecting them. They come with their own perks and benefits that can help you during gameplay. There are many of these, and it can be very difficult to choose between them. It just depends on what you prefer. You can also find XP boosts hidden around the game that can help you to upgrade your characters faster. In addition to these collectibles, you can also find dossiers. These unlock some of the content for the game's gallery. You get a whole bunch of concept art to look at, as well as the game's character models. These look great. You also get plenty of character bios to read to further indulge yourself in the game's story. Features like this are always appreciated by me. You even get a trailer for the movie Planet Hulk, which was quite interesting for what it's worth. You can also unlock an alternate costume for each character. These are usually unlocked by defeating a certain amount of enemies after a certain point in the game. These costumes look great for the most part, and I appreciate the addition. Some of them are based on the classic comic designs of the characters. For example, you can unlock Red Hulk. It's a bit disappointing that you only get one extra costume for each character, since in the first game you had 4, but it is what it is. I still appreciate the inclusion. Another collectible item is the audio recordings. These can be found in various locations and listened to. Again, these do their bit to help you further indulge yourself in the game's lore, though sadly, most of them are kinda boring. Some of them are quite funny though.
Those superheroes are fighting each other near my new Trans Prix! Watch it, you! No!
Reckless superhumans can strike at any time, tossing your car like a toy, ripping up your driveway, or even sending a fiery tornado through your home. When the smoke from their awesome combined attack clears, how will you recover? With Gecko Insurance, our superhuman property damage policy will ensure your losses are completely covered. We'll call in damage control and handle all the paperwork. By the time we're finished, it'll be as if there were no such thing as superhumans.
I wish.
So yeah, despite my criticisms, the game does have plenty of collectibles and bonus features. As far as the graphics and presentation go, these look great for the most part. Despite the bland art style and boring level design, the graphical fidelity itself is really good, and the character models look great, at least for the most part. Some of them do look a bit awkward up close.
But did you really think we wouldn't see it coming?
It's over, Fury! You're alone!
The combat animations look great, and it's a major improvement on the first. And the game seems to run relatively smoothly, though I did run into the occasional frame drops when there were lots of enemies on screen, but nothing major. I did run into the odd clipping glitch from time to time, like this one for example. But yeah, for the most part the game looks great and it runs smoothly. One aspect of the presentation that did disappoint me however was the soundtrack. It's not bad necessarily, but compared to the first game it's just forgettable. There are no epic memorable tracks in this game. So yeah, that pretty much sums up what the game has to offer. Despite being made by a different developer, it follows the same gameplay formula as the first game and even improves and refines certain aspects of it. And objectively speaking, the game is pretty good. But unfortunately there are several things about it, namely the boring level design and lame story, that just sour the experience for me. But let's be honest, with how epic and large scale the first game's story was, and how much was at stake, they were never going to top it in a sequel. The first game had an intergalactic, world-ending threat involving big Marvel villains such as Doctor Doom and Galactus. And the ending of the first game even hinted at Galactus returning to seek revenge for the actions of the heroes in the first game. but sadly that storyline got dropped in favour of the Civil War, which as I mentioned before was poorly executed. Compared to the first game, it just wasn't able to hold my interest for very long, which is a shame because the game had lots of potential. It could have been even better than the first in my opinion, but it never quite achieved it. That's not to say that the game isn't worth playing, I definitely think it is. I just wouldn't recommend it over the first game. I also preferred both X-Men Legends games to this. I give Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 a generous 7 out of 10, which I think is a fair score given my criticisms. Thanks for watching guys. This was a pretty frustrating review to make due to the technical issues I ran into during its production. But hey, we got there in the end, so it's all good. Once again, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to give it a like, since it really helps the channel and also helps to motivate me to keep making videos. Also, be sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. Stay tuned for more retrospective reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.
Get the medics down here.